welcome to Tonetalks. So how are you doing today? This is Antonio Moore coming to you from Tonetalks. I have the wonderful Professor Richard Rothstein, author of Color of Law. Everybody has read that book and been inspired by your works, and I look forward to having a great discussion today about what made you do the work and how we can delve into possibly using this to visualize what race has become in America versus what we have forgot it came from. You know what I'm saying? And I just want to say, did you want to say hello to the audience, and then I'll get into the questions?
Hello.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for making the time today. This is a long time coming. We met sometime back at because of the Angela Project and Louisville work done by Pastor Kevin Cosby and the like. Great time speaking with you out there, but I really wanted to get into, for my audience, a chance to delve into some questions, look at some application of the book, and see where we can go from here. So let's just start off with the first question. What inspired you to write the book Color of Law?
Well, I was a student of education policy. I was writing about education, and I came to understand that the most serious problem we faced in our public schools today was the fact that the schools are segregated. When we take children who have serious economic disadvantages and we concentrate them in single schools, it's inevitable that those schools will not be able to have high achievement. And I wrote many articles over the course of years about the reasons for that. I can give you one example, perhaps asthma. We know that African American children in low-income neighborhoods and urban areas have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. And if you have asthma, you're likely to be drowsy when you come to school the next day because you're up at night wheezing. Maybe you're sleepless. Maybe you're even absent. Asthma is one of the biggest causes of school absenteeism. And then I realized that when you take children like that and you concentrate them in single schools and in single classrooms, so that every child has not just asthma, but any of a number of other social and economic disadvantages, whether it's lead poisoning, which affects children's ability to learn, or stress from being exposed to violence, or homelessness, or unstable homes, or economic insecurity from parental unemployment. You take children with those kinds of problems and you concentrate them in single classrooms and single schools, we can't achieve what we want to do in public education. And when we concentrate children in those schools, we call them segregated schools. And schools are segregated today because they're located in segregated neighborhoods. The reality is that schools are more segregated today than at any time in the last 45 years because of neighborhood segregation. So if I was concerned about education policy, I had to look into why neighborhoods were segregated, and that's how I got into this book.
So when we look at the title, you titled it Color of Law, Forgotten History of How America our government segregated America, and I wanted to know specifically what made you go with that title, Color of Law, and also the additional piece.
Well, the most important word in that title and subtitle is our. A forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Because if the government did segregate it, and I think the book establishes that it did, the book has been out now for 1.5 years, and not a single fact has been challenged in that book. So I think it establishes that we have a government-sponsored, government-created system of segregation. And if the government did it, all of us as American citizens have an obligation to remedy it, to address these violations of civil rights. The segregation of neighborhoods in every metropolitan area is as much a violation of civil rights as any of the things that we dealt with in the 20th century, whether it was segregated water fountains or buses or restaurants. Here we have segregated neighborhoods that are just as much a violation of civil rights because of the way they were created by government. And so it imposes an obligation on all of us as American citizens to do something about it. And so that's the word our in the title. It's our government. And that's critical. The color of law part, well, obviously the color has to do with race, but in the 1960s, when public officials enforced segregation, the term was very commonplace that they were acting under color of law. that they were pretending that this was a legal action that they were taking to create segregation. And so those are the two different meanings of the title.
You know, I've worked with Matt Brunig. He used to be at Demos, and we've done articles together using the Federal Reserve data. We show that 96% of the wealth is held in white hands, somewhere around 2.6 is in black hands. When we do say our, and before I move to the next question, this is just to tag on to the first one, does that absolve white America from their predominant role in actually dealing with wanting to keep hold of the 96% of the wealth versus saying our, which seems like a shared responsibility and a shared access to power to be able to change these things?
Well, this can only be changed by a new civil rights movement. And like the civil rights movements that we had in the 1960s and 50s, and that never dealt with this most important form of segregation at all. A new civil rights movement has to be led by African Americans as well as by whites. We can't have a whites-only civil rights movement to correct this. So it is all of our responsibility to do it. Whites can't correct this on their own.
Okay. I respect that. Number two, when we talk about redlining, and this book really keys in on redlining, the concept that blacks made into contagions, and I'll let you actually delve into that a bit more, made into contagions, and made it so that if a black person bought a home or was allowed to buy a home in the neighborhood, that neighborhood went from an A rating for bank loans post New Deal to an F, basically making black people a contagion to relationships socially for white folks that even wanted to know black folks, and making black folks a contagion to wealth itself, which means just being black destroyed wealth. And so when we talk about redlining and its lasting impact, is this one of the key policy tools that created race as we know it, meaning redlining?
Well, redlining, the term comes from a policy of the federal government in the 1930s. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a New Deal agency, drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country, indicating what areas of every city the federal government could insure mortgages in. And as you say, if a neighborhood had African Americans in it, that neighborhood was given a low rating. It was given a red rating. The areas where African Americans were living were colored red. So that's where the term redlining comes from. People think of it as something that banks did. It's not something that banks did. It's a system that the federal government set up, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So far as the creation of wealth goes, I think the most significant policy that the federal government followed to create wealth and to deny African Americans wealth was a policy of the 1940s and 50s that the Federal Housing Administration maintained to suburbanize the entire white population, white working class population, into single-family homes in the suburbs. This was an explicit racial policy. A program, for example, a place rather, like Levittown, which I think most people are familiar with, east of New York City. But there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these Federal Housing Administration suburbs that were created. Los Angeles became the symbol of suburbanization in the 1950s. Suburbs like Lakewood or Panorama City or Westchester in Los Angeles, all of these were created by the Federal Housing Administration for whites only. So a builder like Levitt, for example, who built Levittown, 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money to build 17,000 homes, which he had no buyers. The only way that Levitt could build that development, or any of these other developers between Los Angeles and New York and everywhere in between, the only way they could build it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their proposals for the development, making a commitment to the Federal Housing Administration that they would never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required that when these developers built these subdivisions, these suburbs, they put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. By this means, the entire white working class population was moved out of the central cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. These are working-class families. They weren't wealthy at the time. They were returning war veterans primarily. The homes were very inexpensive. They cost at that time about $8,000 or $9,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted money, that's about $100,000. Any working-class family can afford to buy a home for $100,000. That's about twice national median income. Especially returning war veterans, black and white, who the Veterans Administration allowed them to buy these homes with no down payment. But only whites were permitted to participate in this program. African Americans were explicitly excluded. And this wasn't, let me say, this was not the action of rogue bureaucrats at the Federal Housing Administration. This policy was written in the Federal Housing Administration's manual that prohibited the approval of bank guarantees, federal bank guarantees for developments that would have African Americans in them. It even prohibited developments from that were all white from being insured if they were located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, it ran the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. Well, this was an explicitly unconstitutional policy the federal government was following. As I say, the homes cost $100,000 in those days. Today, those homes in places like Levittown, or the ones I mentioned in Los Angeles, or anywhere else in the country, they sell, depending on the area, for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, sometimes much more. The white families who were subsidized to buy these homes by the federal government, when I say subsidized, they could move into these homes, leave public housing, where many white working class families were living before this time, and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rented public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy was. Well, over the next few generations, as these homes appreciated in value, the white families who owned them gained wealth. They gained equity in their homes. That's how most families gain wealth in this country. Not the very rich, but typical families gain it from the equity they have in their homes. But the white families who were subsidized by the federal government to move into these all-white, single-family home suburbs used that wealth that they were gaining from the appreciation of their homes to send their children to college. They used it to weather emergencies, whether it was medical or temporary unemployment. They used it to finance their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their own children, so those children could have the funds to make down payments for their own homes. The result of all this was that today African American incomes, on average, that is the money they earn from wages, is about 60%, 60% of white incomes. That's a significant disparity, but that's not what this is about. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth on average, household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that we've never made an effort to remedy.
The interesting thing, I'll say two things, and I'm going to go into the third question, is I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Wolf's work out of NYU. It actually goes to 1% if you take out depreciating assets. When you pull the micro data, much of that 10% that they have for African Americans is the family car. And what happens is that family car actually in depreciating assets like clothes and TV, if you take that stuff out, the middle black family in this country is worth $1,700. Whereas with the white family, it goes from like $130 to like $110. Because their life is built on an inheritance and a transfer that might have happened. So you inherit the house with couch inside, so you don't have to buy the couch. Or you inherit your first car. And so, like, essentially what you actually see is when we take out depreciating assets, that number drops exponentially more. And also, the BLS data does support what you're saying about income. And I just want to be clear for everybody. While you said the $50,000 number generally nationally is $35,000 for black families, the middle black family income in the median black family's income according to BLS. What I wanted to do is also look at our president. And this isn't about a political discussion. This is more just tying him to Levitt. His father got loans to actually do property in New York. when we and it led to the wealth that he actually sits upon, the relationships he sits upon. So when we think about this thing, is this part of the forgotten history of how redlining and how government loans created the America and the racialized America we know today, all the way to President Trump himself through his father, who made his money from the FHA?
Well, yes, as I described, I won't repeat it all. Yes, these policies that you and I have been talking about is what created the enormous wealth gap that we have today. And however you measure it, even if you use the 10% figure I talked about, that's still so far below what the wealth that white families have that we don't need to worry about whether it's 10% or 9% or 1% or 2%, whatever it is. It needs to be remedied because it was created by government, and that's what we need to focus on, which is it's an unconstitutional disparity because it was created in an unconstitutional fashion. It violates the 5th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, even the 13th Amendment, and we need a new civil rights movement that's going to address this and remedy it.
And, you know, I think about what when we deal with the second part of your title, why it's forgotten. And for me, I can't do anything but look at it through the lens of the Cosby Show. And I wanted to share a section with you from an article I wrote called Cosby Show Dreams, African American Financial Realities. And in it, what I say is, to explain further, we can simply look at the home they lived in, talking about the Cosbys and the brownstone that every white and black person saw throughout the 80s to support the statement on their financial position. When BusinessInsider.com recently assessed the home the Huxtables lived in during the early 80s, they stated, while viewers believed the Cosby clan lived in Brooklyn Heights, the real home was located at 10 Leroy in the West Village. In 1984, a Brooklyn Heights brownstone would have gone for around $700,000. A Brooklyn Heights townhome today would be about $5 to $7 million in worth. Giving this context, in the early 1980s, normal home loans were given at a rate of about 15%. A loan of this type would have been likely considerably higher. In addition, a prospective buyer would have to come down with anything from 10 to 20% of the home value. On the low end, this family would have to put down $100,000 cash in 80s money. So I come to this show and I come to the reality of your book and how your book exposes, was it just a matter of us forgetting the history of redlining, or us being told a totally alternate, fantastical version of America, where a family like the Cosbys wouldn't have been redlined out of that neighborhood, where they could come up with $100,000 in 1980, which is somewhere around like $400,000 today, just to put down on the house. And is that part of the propaganda or what happened about the forgetting, or do you have a different reason that we forgot?
Well, I think it's a big puzzle why we forgot, because both African Americans and whites forgot this history. I give a lot of talks around the country about this history, and everywhere I go, people believe, until they hear the history, that we have something called de facto segregation.
Yeah.
De facto segregation is a term that everybody uses: African Americans, whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. It's a very commonplace term. De facto segregation means that it happened without government participation. It happened only because of private prejudice. African Americans, I say, believe that as much as whites do. So all of us need to learn this history, because all of us need to come together, both black and white, to redress what's clearly an unconstitutional situation. If it was de facto segregation, then under our constitutional theories, there would not be an obligation to remedy it. It only happened by private prejudice. But since that de facto...
Can you explain that? Private prejudice versus government prejudice?
Sure. Our constitutional theory today, set down by the Supreme Court and accepted by most legal scholars, is that if the government violates civil rights, then we're obligated to remedy it. But if the disparities that we're talking about, the differences in wealth, the differences in home ownership, the differences in where people live, only occurred because of private prejudice, homeowners refused to sell their homes to other race families, or private banks and real estate agents steered people, or maybe people just like to live with each other of the same race. If it's all of these individual private decisions that created the situation we're in, then we don't have a constitutional obligation to remedy it. It's de facto segregation. Segregation that just happened in fact. not in law. And if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. So it's essential that we understand and we learn the history or relearn the history of how government created the segregation, because learning that history creates an obligation to remedy it and requires us, all of us, I think, as American citizens, to participate in the new civil rights movement to undertake that remedy. Unless we understand that it was not de facto, it was not by accident, we're hobbled in our ability to remedy it. And as I say, it's puzzling to me why we've all forgotten this history. Certainly African Americans knew that they couldn't get FHA mortgages. It wasn't a secret back in the mid-20th century that the government would not insure the mortgages for their homes. Certainly African Americans and whites both knew that they had been directed to separate public housing projects, government-run projects, which were either all white or all black. This was not a mystery back then. And yet, we've still, today, think of this whole situation as being a de facto situation, something that happened without government participation. It's a puzzle how we've all of us forgotten it.
And see that, and that's where I think that particularly a show like the Cosby Show, not in and of itself alone, but as a prominent piece, played a role in that forgetting, because what it presented, instead of a black family that struggled to get into that neighborhood, is a black family that was able to get in that neighborhood without a storyline. And if you don't give that storyline, you present a narrative like this history never happened, like that neighborhood wouldn't have had covenants in the deeds, like they had $100,000 in 1980. In 1980, a neighborhood, a house that's worth $2 million here in Los Angeles was only worth $130. So fundamentally, I think it creates a narrative like race itself didn't happen. And what it also sounds like in some ways, one of my takeaways from this book is that government created the racial system as we know it today. They fundamentally almost created white wealth from nothing and decided that black people would not be able to partake in that rise. Is that a fair enough takeaway?
That's exactly the takeaway. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Excuse me, and I think that everybody needs to understand. We have a government-sponsored system of residential segregation. It creates much of the inequality we have today. I described before how this residential segregation creates educational inequality. It also creates health inequality. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, higher rates of heart disease, because so many of them live in unhealthy neighborhoods with more pollution, more smoke, less well maintained. It certainly creates the outrageous way in which our criminal justice system is maintained. We would not have situations like Ferguson or Milwaukee or Baltimore or any other cases where police are engaged in violent attacks and confrontations on young men if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in this country in single neighborhoods without access to jobs, without access to opportunity, without even access to the transportation that would get them to jobs. So residential segregation underlies our most serious social problems. It's not just the wealth gap, it's the things I just mentioned in education and health and criminal justice. And unless we address it, unless we address the underlying cause of all these inequalities, we're never going to remedy them.
I'm glad you brought up the wealth gap, because one of my last two questions. You know, I interviewed Thomas Shapiro, author of Black Wealth, White Wealth, who along with Melvin came up with the whole concept of the racial wealth gap. In that interview, one of the things I pushed back on is why we should have never called it a wealth gap. Because fundamentally what we see is a situation where there's a haves and have-nots. It's not just a gap. I think a gap is where you know, black families have $75,000 in wealth, white families have $100,000 in wealth. Why I think it's important to take out depreciating assets, as I said earlier, is I think there is a fundamental difference between a family worth $1,600, $1,700 and a family literally almost worth nothing at $1,500. And so I bring this up in terms of this discussion. You know, is it really just a matter of is it more us acknowledging this is about race than just wealth? Because can we really fix this if white people want to stay white? I asked Shapiro the same question. If they want to keep the advantage in the positioning they have in relation to black people, can we actually move anywhere in this whole fight against, you know, redlining, the wealth gap, and everything alike?
Well, I think about it a little bit differently. Um, White people did not get an advantage through the policies I was just talking about. They got what they were entitled to. When the New Deal, the Federal Housing Administration, created suburbs of single-family homes, that was a good program. The problem was not that whites got an advantage of moving into them. The problem was that African Americans were denied that same opportunity. Everybody should have been entitled to that kind of subsidy to move into a single-family home. So I think that it's not helpful to talk about whites having gotten an advantage. What we should be thinking about is that African Americans were denied that same opportunity, and that's what needs to be remedied.
And I guess the pushback is just by virtue of giving them that wealth opportunity, they created the advantage. Whether it was the white person's goal to be advantaged is another question. But the advantage was baked into creating a system where there would be a group of people who would be easy to take advantage of because of your new wealth position. Whereas before that, we all were impoverished together, not owning homes. So, I mean, I understand where you're coming from as well, that they weren't intending to. And one of the interesting parts I took away from your book is the different instances where white people actually wanted to befriend and be social with black people, but it was against their wealth interests, because if they did, they were either created and made into black people. What I mean by that is stripped of their advantage of whiteness. You will be somebody that will be treated like a black person in terms of home loans. We had that example a couple times in your book where a white person tried to sell their home to a black person regardless of the laws and was basically made into a type of black person by not being able to get an FHA loan anymore. Or we see examples where white people were ostracized by community or lost wealth if a black person came into their community because their homes dropped in value. And I think that this whole insidious system requires us to get really honest about race and what race has done in America even after slavery. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree that people need to understand this history. I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that we're not going to create the kind of civil rights movement that we need if we try to blame the beneficiaries of programs to which they were entitled for the inequalities in this country. We need to focus on the government policies that created it, on the denial to African Americans of rights that they should have had. But if we think that African Americans should have had those rights, and we do, then we can't deny that whites also had rights to those programs. These were things that should have been done. The New Deal should have built single-family homes and subsidized working-class families to move into them. The New Deal should have built public housing when there was a big housing shortage. What it should not have done was segregated those programs and prohibited African Americans from participating in the same degree as whites. And if we understand that, then we'll be able to come together in a civil rights movement that requires the participation both of African Americans and of whites in order to correct this. African Americans can't do it by themselves, and neither can whites. We need a biracial civil rights movement as we had in the 1950s and 60s when we addressed some of these other forms of segregation.
I love the educational debate, and I think the audience will as well. And the only thing I will say that is really interesting about the moment that your book is the time your book is written about is while I understand what you're saying about the beneficiaries, we have this moment where we could have had a discussion about reparations for black folks as a result of slavery, and instead of giving them reparations, you gave them disadvantage. I'm talking about the government at large, not even dealing with white folks. So, I mean, it just created such a system where a group that already had just came out of slavery was now pushed even further as a result of advantaging white people by giving them loans that black people couldn't access. So now comes the question of how we unfold it, and this is the last question. I believe you can only fix the impact of redlining with a type of black New Deal. And I've talked to Sandy Darity about that, Dark Hamilton. I did a study with both of them that's on the Duke website. And I believe that New Deal has to be focused not just on black people, but on American DOS, which is a term me and Yvette Carnell of Breaking Brown have come up, American descendants of slaves, not just anybody that has brown skin. What is your thoughts on how a redress plan would look to redlining?
Well, there are many, many policies that we could follow. Figuring out the policies to follow to remedy this is not hard. What's hard is developing the political will to support the new civil rights movement that I've talked about. But for example, the government should start buying up homes in these suburbs at their current market prices, which are $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, sometimes more, in these suburbs from which African Americans are excluded, and resell them to African Americans, qualified African Americans, for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. We should stop subsidizing segregated homes in all white suburbs that adopt policies that exclude lower income and moderate income families from living there. One of the ways we subsidize single family homeowners in all white suburbs is with the mortgage interest deduction. It's the single largest federal program in the housing area that we operate. We spend far, far more on the mortgage interest deduction than we spend on programs to subsidize low income families. That mortgage interest deduction should be withheld from homeowners in suburbs that refuse to take steps to desegregate, whether by maintaining maintain their segregation by maintaining zoning laws that prohibit the construction of townhouses or even single-family homes on small lot sizes. It doesn't have to be a punitive program. The federal government could tell families in those suburbs that they'll put their mortgage interest deductions in escrow and return them when the suburbs take steps to desegregate. That would be another program we could follow. We currently have programs at the low end for low-income families, heavily African American. The Section 8 voucher program is one. Another is the low-income house tax credit, which subsidizes builders to build low-income housing. Both of those programs reinforce segregation because it's easier to build low-income housing in already segregated neighborhoods, further increasing its segregation. We should reform that program so that low-income housing is built in high-opportunity neighborhoods where people can gain wealth, where they can get opportunity, where they can gain access to better jobs. So there are many policies we could follow to remedy this. The first step, however, has to be to understand that we have an obligation to remedy it, and we need to develop the will to do so.
Professor Rothstein, I just want to say my audience for Tone Talks definitely appreciates you tuning in and giving us your time today. This debate will rage on. Your book is pushing that discussion forward, and it's making it clear that we have forgotten the history about redlining that we should remember and should be part of our daily discussion. Thank you so much.